So yeah, I want to zero in on a different spatial and temporal scale from Roberto, but very much in the same theoretical spirit, which is to think about waves of what he called creative destruction, but waves of change in the spatial organizations that we see in a capitalist economy and a capitalist society, and specifically to sort of use that framework in terms of logics of what we might call convergence and divergence between territories I'll speak mostly about the developed countries, but we can think about some developing countries also. And I want to think about the current period, which I'm going to define from 1980 onward, and that is specifically the period of what we might call the Schumpeterian wave of the Third Industrial Revolution. And I want to contrast it to the previous period, which was much of the 20th century, which was a period at the end of the Second Industrial Revolution, which was a period when our territories were converging. So convergence in a previous period and zeroing on divergence in the world we are still living in. So interregional inequalities, that's another way of saying divergence. Interregional inequalities in per capita income, in job creation, the types of jobs and the levels of job creation, and productivity. They are growing in the European Union and in the USA. And they've been growing since 1980. And this is what, again, it's a great inversion or a change when we compare it to the middle of the 20th century, all right? So in the middle of the 20th century, again, 1940 to 1980, but maybe even before 1940, we were seeing spread and convergence of development, spread and convergence of development levels between the regions and between cities and other types of regions. So we saw not only a smoothing out of the map of per capita income in all of the advanced capitalist democracies, but we also saw demographic smoothing out, meaning that suburbs and outlying areas and smaller metropolitan areas had higher rates of population growth than big old metropolitan centers. But since 1980, all of that switches around. We throw all those movements into reverse, and what we get is big metropolitan regions being favored, including the inner areas of big metropolitan regions. Other regions are falling behind, and now we have a term which is we commonly refer to the territorial focus of development being basically a bunch of superstar regions and then everywhere else. Okay, that's a bit of a generalization, but it's basically true. So process of interregional economic convergence stops, goes into reverse when we transition from the Second Industrial Revolution, that is the revolution that starts basically in the 1880s, which is based around mechanical technologies, around mechanical engineering, around electricity, petroleum, and all of those industries. That's the technology shock of the late 19th century. It builds up a bunch of industries and a bunch of production complexes around a great wave of urbanization from 1880 to 1920, and then it moves into a spreading out period of putting the wealth, the jobs, the people, and the incomes in more and more territories of all of the advanced countries and a number of developing ones. But all of that, once you get a third shock, which is the digital, finance, healthcare, pharmaceutical, and globalization shock, basically in the 1970s, and then implants itself as the core logic of capitalism in the 1980s. This third industrial revolution throws the territorial logics into reverse again. Okay? So this is what we now call the new geography of jobs, the new geography of skills, the new geography of opportunity, employment, productivity, and a whole bunch of economic variables. So again, with variations, this is the same basic trend in most Western countries and some developing ones. Here's just a few kind of, illustrative statistics. You look at metropolitan areas in America, Washington, D.C., in 1980, its per capita income is 29% above that of the U.S. as a whole. Now it's 68% above. You look at San Francisco Bay Area, which is the ground zero of the Third Industrial Revolution, from 50% above to 88% above. You look at New York, which is ground zero of the financial revolution, and it's from 80% above to 172% above. That's very typical. If you took the top 20 metropolitan areas in America, you'd see the same story with variations. If you look here, it's hard to see. Basically what we've done is, as the colors go from light to dark, we've divided the regions of Europe into 4 different per capita income classes. All right, so roughly speaking, from less than 70% of the EU average, 70 to 95% of the EU average, that's sort of a middle income. 95 to 120 is high income. Over 120% is very high. As they get to purple, as they get to the darker ones, you see higher and higher income. And that's just to give you a sense that even within the western part of the European Union, we do not have territorial economic convergence. Of course, the East is another story, because these are less developed countries that are still in a kind of entering into the capitalist world. But nonetheless, even within the old, what we call convergence club, there's not convergence anymore. Moreover, there's a dynamic here. So where is population change happening the most? Here in the European Union, it's that people are going to where the money is. They're going to the richer regions and away from the poorer ones. Somewhat as you might expect rationally, right? If people are looking for opportunity. The opportunity is concentrated. The other thing that's happening, though, is that more jobs are being created in the higher income regions. Now, for those of you trained in economic theory, you know immediately that that sounds strange, because it goes against the sort of core principle of the law of one price in economics, which is that there should be tendencies toward mean reversion between places at different levels. So what's going on, though, is that the jobs are being created in the expensive places, not in the cheap places. All right? It's different from what's going on at a world scale, but within our countries, they're being created in the expensive places, where costs are high, living costs are high, and wages are high. Think about that. That's not your standard, it's not a standard theoretical proposition. This is, of course, the classical case of the supernova of London, which is what you see in the red line is the north of England. You see the other 2 lines are London proper and the southeast, which is basically the greater London orbit. And you see this extremely sharp difference in growth of economic output between the 2 parts of England. Very similar. You'd have a very similar story in France. You'd have a very similar story in America, not with one region, but with the superstar regions versus the rest. Okay, so how do we think about this in economic geography? Our normal sort of model for thinking about economic geography, whether at a national level or at a global level, is that economic theory tells us that economies should tend toward convergence. All of our core models in economics tell us that. They should have a smoothing out as a deep logic. And there are 3 mechanisms of convergence if we think about it in terms of long-term processes of development. One is the mobility of capital. That is, firms, jobs with similar wage composition should spread out. And they should spread out as they seek cheaper costs and to avoid congestion and high costs in expensive places. Okay? So that's one principle. A second is people. That is, people should go to opportunity, and they should go away from unemployment and away from being stuck. And as they do that, as they leave places behind where they don't have opportunity, they should lower unemployment in those regions and thereby allow wages to rise in them. And as they go to opportunity, they should also bring down the wages of those places and smooth out the landscape. That's just sort of core economics model, for territorial dynamics. And a third thing is more sort of qualitatively developmental, which is that we expect that there should be a spreading of basic capacities over time. That is, the evening out of capacities to innovate, to do entrepreneurship, and to be economically creative. In any process of economic integration, that's what should happen as a circulation of people, better infrastructures, and the circulation of physical artifacts like machines and other implements goes on. These are what we anticipate from theory. However, that's not happening, all right? Not since 1980. The third industrial revolution has what we call very high agglomeration economies. The high skill and high income jobs are overwhelmingly concentrated in superstar metros today, and ever more with every passing year. This is again different from the mature phase of the previous Industrial Revolution. And moreover, the previous Industrial Revolution had a sort of, it had a maturation phase where it had many innovation centers. It had a lot of small and medium-sized metropolitan areas which were just as wealthy, if not wealthier, than the big metropolitan areas. So what we call the size premium of cities was much weaker in the 20th century than it is today. The premium, that is the advantage to being a big metropolitan area, has grown again, as opposed to the past, okay? So the bottom line is that those previous areas that were the beneficiaries of the spreading out of the second industrial revolution have largely been deindustrialized and continue to be deindustrialized. And there are reasons, there's technological change and globalization that produce that kind of emptying out of their good jobs, and especially of skilled jobs, of managerial jobs, and of innovation jobs in those places that they used to have a lot of, all right? And in this industrial revolution, skilled, innovative, well-paying employment is spatially concentrated. So, now, faced with that sort of underlying reality of jobs, we have another thing that's happened since 1980, which is that internal migration within the developed economies has slowed and it's changed directions. So, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, migration is, over time, one of the key mechanisms by which income, skills, and wealth even out over the landscape. Right? The constant rearrangement of people and their rematching to what the economy is doing is a key dynamic of how the landscape changes over time. It's like a dance between capital and labor, all right? A very complex dance over time. Now, what we see, and so take the country which is par excellence considered to be the country of internal or domestic mobility and migration. It's the United States of America, right? Famously mobile Americans. From 1880 to 1980, 3.7% of American households changed state per year. If you compound that over time, you have a lot of mobility. And that vastly understates mobility because only 1/3 of the mobility is interstate. 2/3 of it's within states, such that about every decade, in recent decades, you have something like 50 to 60 million American households change location beyond their initial commuting zone. That's a huge churning going on of population all the time. But since 1980, that interstate migration, the longer distance part, collapsed to less than half of its historical level, and it never came back up. All right? Now, the previous wave of internal migration, again taking the American example, was a great force for spreading out and evening out the landscape, the economic landscape of the US. In this period, from 1940 to 1980, there was an outward movement of manufacturing from the Northeast, the old core, to the South and the West. It deindustrialized the Northeast, but it evened out the landscape. It was stimulated by reactionary labor laws in the South, which were much more hostile to unions, so that was a pull factor. But also massive state investments in the South, and I would also add the West, corresponding to very cheap housing and lower wages. And in any case, the result of this, so with complex kinds of reasons, right? Some of them may be good, some may be not so good. In any case, the result was a strong evening out of the landscape so that the income levels between American states very strongly converged. So the gap between the richest states like Connecticut and the poorest states like Mississippi were cut by 2/3 during that period. All right? Since the 1990s, all of that changes. Not so much between the states, but between the superstar cities, the great metropolitan areas, and everywhere else. What's going on since the 1990s, roughly, when the third industrial revolution is really kicking in and affecting people's choices and behaviors, is that the superstar metropolitan areas are receiving the domestic skilled and the domestic young. They're receiving the foreign skilled and a lot of foreign unskilled. And there's a strong complementarity what you might call in vernacular a win-win between the foreign unskilled and these two classes of skilled labor, in the sense that they don't compete for the same jobs, and the first set of high-skilled jobs creates a lot of demand in the service sector for people who will fulfill jobs in the lower-wage service sector, who are filled mostly by foreign immigrants. Middle-range metropolitan areas in America but elsewhere, what they're getting is the outmigration of the sort of domestic middle classes from the very expensive metropolitan areas. That's a long-term pattern, who are going to places like Texas or Arizona or Florida, right? Because these are cheaper places to live. But you're also getting something very demographically interesting, especially in the American case, which is upwardly mobile foreign immigrant families, second and third generation Latinos, and plus in the US case, return migration of middle and upper middle class black families from the coasts in the north back to the south, all right? College-educated blacks, college-educated Latinos go away from the superstar metros because they have high enough skills and high enough budgets to live in these places better than they can live in New York, Boston, Los Angeles, or San Francisco. All right, but they're creating what we call the new melting pots, the newly diversifying in terms of ethnic and class terms, developing metropolitan areas of the inner United States and particularly of its Sun Belt. Then there's this old heartland area, what we might call the old heartland. The old heartland is being depleted of its young and its skilled. It has an aging and non-mobile economic elite, basically, to put it a little crudely, a bunch of old white people. It has a spatially trapped domestic lower-skilled population, so lower-skilled white people who can't seem to get out of these areas. And in these regions, foreign immigration competes with the lower-skilled domestic population for what jobs there are. So they are not complementary labor market segments, they're competitive labor market segments. So all in all, this is a profoundly different world from the one that was coming about in many of those decades of the 20th century. Again, why is this happening? To summarize, the third industrial revolution, it brings into being a set of highly innovative industries that are not yet fully mature and not yet fully routinized. They're world-shaping industries, notably around digital technologies, finance, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and they are still in a strongly innovative phase, which causes them to have strong innovative ecologies or clusters of most of their skilled functions. And what we haven't yet seen in this third industrial revolution is a cooling down of that process, of a sort of a turning point where they start to spread out the skilled work. They spread out already a lot of their routine work, like your computer is made in either sort of inner regions with cheap labor, or it's made in countries with cheap labor, but the stuff that's invented to go into your computer is still produced and invented in Silicon Valley. And most of the jobs in places like Silicon Valley are in those kind of invention and creation functions. All right. So economic theory tells us that this can't go on very long. All right? So if you want to sort of have like a little bit of a dialogue between the facts we observe and what our theories tell us, conventional economics says that the skilled are going to get sick of big cities. And they're going to get sick of them because housing and the cost of living continue to rise differentially between superstar metros and everywhere else, okay? But the evidence continues to go contrary to what our theories tell us should already be happening. So here's a really startling number that we've only begun to understand. It's not just that the superstar cities concentrate a lot of people with skills. That's part of the reason why they're rich, is they simply have more of their population that has college educations and is working in cutting-edge, innovative, creative economic functions. That's what we might call a compositional effect. But in addition, there's a productivity effect. So that a person with a university education, if you take that same person, right, in 1970 and you put them in a rural area of America and you clone that person and put them in San Francisco, there would have been about, on average, a 5% difference in the wages that they would have received. Okay, so that's called the urban wage premium, was very small in 1970. Today, it's probably 5 times bigger. So that with the same human characteristics, that if you clone yourself, the one of you who goes to San Francisco, on average, will make 25% more than that same version of you going to some other city. So it's not just how many of you there are, it's something about what happens to you when you work in these places, in these kinds of systems, all right? So that's kind of the core spatial economics of it. And secondly, your lifetime earnings, even after we correct for the much higher cost of living in places like New York and San Francisco and London and Paris, they will be much higher than the cloned version of you that goes to a small town, even though you're living cheaper, because of what we call experience effects. You'll change jobs more times, you'll acquire more experience, you'll buy a house, you'll get real estate capitalization, and you'll end up much richer than the person who lives in a cheaper area, even a person with your same characteristics, okay? So housing is expensive for you when you go to these places, but much more lifetime capitalization in addition to a much steeper growth in your wage curve when you go to these places. So now here comes the debate. That's what I would say, as I understand it, are the sort of stylized economic geography facts of our time in the third industrial revolution up till now. Now, the debate happens about, are these big cities good for us anymore? All right? And the debate in mainstream economics is that our cities are now distorted, that they have costs that are too high, but they're not welcoming enough to the unskilled. And they're not welcoming enough to the unskilled, according to mainstream urban economics, because of NIMBYs. NIMBYs means not in my backyard, neighborhood activists who prevent these hotspots from constructing enough housing so that they would have space and lower prices that could welcome more of the suffering masses that are excluded from them and are kept out by ramparts and are now suffering in the countryside because of the exclusionary politics of the professional managerial classes and the neighborhood groups who are concentrated in the prosperous cities of the world. That's the story that mainstream economics tells us, and it's also the story, interestingly enough, that is shared by a lot of urban social justice groups. So the mainstream economists and the urban social justice groups are basically lining up on the same side of this debate. And the debate is, we've got to break the power of the NIMBYs and the neighborhoods and construct more housing, because then all those people, those less skilled domestic populations who would, in their view of things, would like to get into the hot spots, would then be able to get into, because according to them, the main barrier is that there isn't enough housing in these big cities. So housing has now become not a local issue, but a highly politicized interregional or national issue in many countries in a way that wasn't previously the case. So the NIMBY elites on the coasts in America, we would say, are keeping us out. There's a politics of resentment, not just within urban areas through gentrification, but at a national scale. So the British version of this would be, let's build on the London Greenbelt so that people from the north could get into the southeast and get away from areas where there's no opportunity and tap into London's opportunity machine. And every country, Paris, it's the same thing, right? The Gilets jaunes, the deal is you're keeping us out of Paris. As populist geographers would say, it's a rampart. It's like a new medieval wall around Paris, keeping the lower classes out. So this is the politics of housing now, it turns out, is one of the key political features of this new economic geography. And I think there's no question that all big cities have highly regulated housing markets, right? I'm always amused when you get all this literature about like neoliberal cities and this kind of idea that everything's unregulated. I mean, I don't know of any big city in the world where housing and land are not extremely highly regulated and more regulated than at any point in the past. I can't think of any tendency to deregulate housing or land construction in cities. All in every quantitative index that we have on this shows that it's gone in the opposite direction, okay? So most of this, of course, does respond to sociological dynamics, which is current residents, both the new skilled classes, but also many of the pre-existing popular classes in the big cities. They don't want more construction, right? They don't want gentrification or displacement. They don't want neighborhood change. They want to stay where they are in the case of the old working classes, and in the case of the new, what we might call sort of skilled classes, right? They want a quality of life, and they don't want to be run over by developers. So you get a coalition between them, right? This, of course, favors current residents and landowners and transfers income to them, right? Because if you're already a landowner, you reap, you're the big winner in this geographical lottery. So this is probably contributing to inequality, both social and spatial, and a lot of the mainstream economists, notably, for example, someone like Enrico Moretti, who's written a lot on this, show that this is the case, right? So there's a new political coalition, and that's what's kind of interesting about it, which is that some social justice groups are aligning with developers, right, to promote liberalized housing construction and reduce regulation because they believe that that will bend the curve of affordability and, I don't know, somehow miraculously prevent gentrification. I'll come back to that in a second. But there's some interesting new kind of reformulations of the politics of housing that are direct outcomes of this cycle of development that's generated by the third industrial revolution. So is housing really responsible for limiting interregional migration to prosperous cities? Or we could restate it in a really polemical way, is housing responsible for Trump, Brexit, and the Gilets jaunes? All right? Just make that linkage, right? Is that the source of frustration? I don't actually think that's the right analysis, so I'm going to now differ with the mainstream economic analysis, and I'm also going to differ with some of the social justice coalitions. All right? First of all, I don't think additional market housing would attract, would allow the non-skilled to access big cities, right? I think that what would happen is with additional market housing, you would get probably some population increase in big cities, but it's going to be more skilled people, right? Because they're the ones who can pay for the market housing, given the cost of construction, which are kind of structurally established. It might, therefore, if you constructed more housing, actually push even more people out of their existing neighborhoods, because the spatial competition between the skilled and the unskilled in the big cities, we know who will win it, right? And paradoxically, it could actually accelerate interregional polarization, because those skilled people who are for other reasons maybe kind of like sitting on the fence and saying, do I go to Paris and London or New York, or do I stay in an outlying region? If you give them better housing or slightly cheaper housing in San Francisco or LA or New York and London, that's what will get them to leave. And then the outlying regions will have even fewer skilled people and will become more homogeneously poor and low-skilled and aged, which is already their underlying demographics in every single country that I've seen. So, for example, what we don't see is any kind of notion which the mainstream economists argue will happen, which is that if you don't have enough housing, that somehow the job creation machine will slow down, right? That you won't be able to get people in, therefore you won't be able to get jobs in. We haven't seen it in any great American metropolitan areas. The highest priced American metropolitan areas have the highest rates of job and population growth now of any of the regions. The San Francisco Bay Area and New York, which are the two most expensive ones, are at historical population heights and historical job heights. So it's exactly, this is a real twister for economic modeling. I mean, we're trying to figure it out. And probably what's going on is, indeed, that people are paying more for housing, the skilled people are paying more for housing, that the unskilled are probably crowding and making adjustments, like they're commuting farther or they're living in smaller housing. So yeah, so there are these ricochet effects through the housing market. What it's not doing is stopping them from coming. And the reason they're coming is that there are economic benefits to doing it, meaning their lifetime earnings are for sure going to be higher even in the face of it. It's not an ideal situation, but what it's not doing is what's predicted by the standard economic models. That's kind of the important point for the policy debate. So why don't let's now turn back to that less skilled domestic population, the proverbial Trump, Brexit, Gilets jaunes type people who are in these other regions, all right? Why aren't they moving to urban opportunity? What's going on there? I think the likely, what we're zeroing in on is it's not because of housing principally. It's because of job mismatch, meaning they lack the skills to fit into the upper segment of the urban labor market. These require university degrees at a minimum, right? But more importantly, they require soft skills. They require having had the social origins that enable them to have the internships, build the networks, understand the world of urban work today, which is much, you need not only a university degree, but you need all of these other social skills to get in. And those people can't get them where they are. Even going to university in an outlying region, even with a good diploma, they will not be able to understand how to get into New York or London or Paris or San Francisco. And now, why, you might say, this is an economist type question, which might strike some in the audience as a little bit cruel, but why not seek the jobs that are being occupied by the lower skilled foreign immigrants who are crowding into these prosperous metropolitan regions? In other words, why don't these people take those jobs? And we know sociologically why this is the case, because it would generate a kind of lower social mobility, a kind of déclassement, right? They would be lower on the status hierarchy in relative terms in a superstar metro than they are in their poor outlying region. At least what they have where they are is that they're pretty decently ranked in the regions where they are. And there are, of course, racial and ethnic dimensions of this as well, right? But that if you do the counterfactual and say, well, go to San Francisco, you'll find a job at least, and you'll get paid more than you will in the region where you're at, they will say, yeah, but I'll be outcompeted by some foreigner, and moreover, I'll have to live in a neighborhood with those people where I don't have to do that in my outlying region, where I'm culturally dominant in my outlying region. And moreover, the long-term probability of unemployment is high for me anyway, because those foreign people are going to take it away from me. And that's probably all factually true. So the result is that the left-behind regions continue to deteriorate, all right? As the talented move out in the left-behind regions, the rest are left over. And interestingly enough, the real sort of crisis, we might say, of the sort of crisis regions, spatially speaking today, are not the inner city ghettos the way they were in the 1960s and 1970s. They're the left-behind regions that are mostly populated by basically white people, white domestic populations in the developed countries, right? That's where the social crisis is now emerging. Social and economic decline are going together in the EU deindustrialized regions and both in the old frost belt deindustrialized and job-growing low-income regions. So you get now intergenerational transmission of education and social network failure in these left-behind regions that are trapping more and more people in this kind of vicious cycle. Oddly enough, right, Oscar Lewis, when he invented the term culture of poverty, looking at the, the colonias proletarias in Mexico City in 1961, he was thinking about rural migrants to big cities, and then later on that was taken over by urban sociology in America and thought about black ghettos. But if the concept, the cultures of poverty are more like in Appalachia or the Midwest or the center of France today or the north of England than they are in any of our inner city so-called ghettos. So again, this kind of cycle, these cycles of development that I'm speaking about, of different Schumpeterian waves or industrial revolutions, they also flip the territories of social pathology and downward spirals. So that's what we're going through today. All All right, I'm out of time. I wanted to conclude, and maybe I'll just do this with this kind of quote, which I think is exactly right, which is that the kind of regional inequalities that I'm starting to describe here are really proving too politically dangerous to ignore. That's what the Economist wrote after the shocking events of 2016. And they continued and they said, orthodox economics, and I think they're right here, has few questions to the problem of regional inequality. And if economists can't provide the answers, populist insurgents will. And we know where that leads, right? It leads to these kind of maps that we're all familiar with, including, I think Roberto and I had some similar maps, right? These are the maps of the world, right? So thank you very much for listening, and I'll welcome the debate.